So how to use teaching as a learning tool. So hi, I'm Carl Alexander. I'm from Montreal, Canada. I'm a PHP developer, but I tend to just speak more at WordPress conferences. If you want to get a hold of me, you can find me at @twigpress on Twitter or at carlalexander.ca. That's where I write a lot of articles, both PHP and WordPress. I have about 50 of some. So today I want to talk about how to improve our skills. We're all developers here? Yeah. As developers, we're always trying to improve our skills. Like, I don't know one developer that's like, I think I'm done now. Like, for the next 10 years, I'm just going to coast on what I know and not learn another thing for the rest of my days. We're always reading blog posts. Some of us watch screencasts. And we also listen to talks. Because these are all great ways to learn new things. But I don't think a lot of us have taught about teaching as a way of learning something. But teaching is another really great learning tool. And it's one of those learning tools where you don't really think too much about it, because the first thing that you'll think about is, shouldn't you know what you're trying to teach before you try to teach it? And it feels like it shouldn't work. You shouldn't be able to learn anything by teaching it. But that's what we were going to talk about. And the first step is to understand why teaching can improve your programming skills. So how does this work? I definitely had my doubts. I've only been kind of teaching other developers for the last 3 years or so. And when I started, I was like, well, same questions as everybody else. Like, shouldn't I know what I'm trying to teach? Shouldn't I, like, I'm not qualified to be the one teaching other developers about other topics. But that really changed a lot once I got into the idea of teaching and I started doing it. And the quote that I really like, that I'm sure a lot of us have heard before, is, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. I don't know who here has heard this quote before? Yeah, it's a very common quote. Actually, when I researched this, I was trying to, that's why there's the question mark, because a lot of people assign it to Einstein, but it's really one of those like quotes that it's not really clear who said it. It's also associated to Richard Feynman and Ernest Rutherford. But really, I did this talk all about this quote. I was basically, after a while, I was like, you know, there's a lot about this quote that's true, and I want to explain to other developers why that is. And the first thing that I like to talk about is what I call the great deception, which is basically the standard, which is like learning by doing. Like, who believes here, well, who does learning by doing? As in, like, I want to learn something, I'm going to do it. Yeah. You know, we've all done it. I still do it. You basically do something until it works. And once it works, well, you kind of learn something in the process, you know? Like, you're at the end, you took some, hopefully you took something out of the experience of building, of doing something. But where it really kind of starts breaking down is when you ask yourself, like, what did I really learn, like, at the end of, like, let's say I wanted to learn to do a React app. You know, I just read some tutorials, I did some things, you know. But if you arrived and your colleague was like, yo, you know, can you explain it? Can you tell me, like, how you got this React app going, or, you know, you use this new PHP feature? And often, well, I did it this way and it worked. And you know, and I've used this like with other coworkers plenty of times, and you're like, well, it kind of works, and especially like as developers, you're like, once it works, you kind of don't touch it either. You're like, you don't touch what works already. But what we really did is we learned where to find the solution. We learned what Stack Overflow question should you learn. Actually, I have a really funny anecdote around that because I'm trying to get better at JavaScript, and I always struggled with JavaScript and learning better JavaScript and modern JavaScript. And when my friend was like, each time you Google, just put ES6 in front. And I was like, oh my God, this is so much better. But really, did I learn more about JavaScript or how JavaScript worked? A bit, but what I really learned is how to get the answers out of Google more efficiently. And that's why you're not always any closer to answering the why of like why you did something or why does something work. And sometimes a lot of the theories and concepts still kind of elude us. We use frameworks, we use the classes in the frameworks. We're not necessarily sure how those classes work, the patterns, how those patterns work, how all those pieces work together, because we're really just using them. And it's really hard to explain them necessarily to somebody else, besides just saying, well, look at my code, look at what I did, and that works, so you should just copy that. And that's why if you want to get better, you want to take it to the next level, which is learning by teaching. And learning by teaching isn't really a new thing. You still have to get the great thing with learning by teaching is you still have to get your hands dirty. You can't just teach something and not have it work. You still have to get it working. You still have to make sure that like the code that you write works, but you have to push things a lot more, because the working solution, just saying, well, I did it this way and it worked, isn't really a valid answer anymore, because you're really accountable to the people that you want to teach it back to. And this doesn't have to be like in a conference right here. Like it could just be like if you're a team lead and you have to explain it to the other people on your team, or if you do like little presentations and stuff like that within your company, you still have to share knowledge back, and you're much more accountable to the people, the students, the people listening to you, and that kind of pushes the boundaries, forces you to really learn things much more in depth than you would have otherwise. And that's what I was kind of alluding to, because you really need to be explained what you did and why you did it. And that really changes the dynamic around learning. You're not really learning to just solve the problem anymore. You're learning to teach it back to someone. And on top of that, the teaching back aspect forces you to really master what you're trying to teach. So you not only have to be able to explain the theory and the concepts, but you have to be able to answer questions. And speaking of questions, I really like, if you want to ask me any questions during the talk, that's fine. And also, I have question breaks during the talk. So if at certain points you have questions, you can feel free to ask me. But questions are super, super important, because they're really what tests the boundaries of what you know, what you don't know. And it's really important. Most of the best developers I know are the ones that know what they don't know, or at least are questioning what they don't know. And being able to answer questions, being forced to answer those questions is really, really important from an educational, from a skill development basis. You also have to learn to make things simple. And this is a meme that comes from a bit the WordPress community, because I do a lot of teaching like computer science concepts to WordPress developers, and often they just get confused, they kind of lose track really easily. But for me, the aspect of this meme has always been this importance of that teaching is communication. And teaching is about making things simple, like of finding the essence of what you're trying to teach so that they can get it, they can get the most out of it and get it really the essence of the concepts. Otherwise, your students won't understand. And again, I don't know if you've tried like simplifying code or simplifying things. Like simplifying is really hard because you're always trying to get to the essence of things. Yes, okay, perfect. Yeah, so you need to get to the essence of a topic. So if you want to try to explain domain-driven design or event sourcing, you really have to be able, you can't just arrive and just explain everything, every detail. You have to like start and find what is the essence of the topic that the person needs to know at first and like really distill that information. And that requires a lot more effective learning strategies because you can't just read everything and expect somebody to just do it. You have to be able to read everything, take everything that you've learned and distill it and be able to explain it back. And these learning strategies, you wouldn't have used it otherwise. If you were just learning by doing, you wouldn't have tried to learn more. You would have just tried to learn how to do it. And you would have searched Stack Overflow. You would have, did Google search and things like that. And the result is really a better understanding of the topics. For me, teaching has made me a much better, I feel has made me a much better developer because a lot of the concepts that I could read in the code, like in Symfony's code or things like that, until I started teaching them back to other people, I didn't really understand the design decision. I'm taught about like what they had done, why they had done it. And it really helped me better understand Symfony and other PHP frameworks to just look at what they did and what they were doing. And that's really the essence behind that quote. If you can't really explain something simply, you don't really know it well enough. I don't know if anybody has questions so far. So the next step is, when do you know if you know enough to teach? And I always call this the kind of catch-22 of teaching, because the reality is that we never feel like we know enough. And part of it is just like impostor syndrome, where we think, well, I don't really know it, so I can't really teach it, or who am I to teach this to other developers? But in fact, there's a lot more to teaching than what you know. And I would go so far and say that sometimes when you're really in the moment of trying to learn something is usually the best time to teach it, because you're really empathizing, like you're trying to learn it. So you're going through all the kind of problems, the struggles of learning a new topic, and it's going to be really, really fresh for you trying to teach it to somebody else, because you'll know, oh, I really stumbled on this, or I really struggle learning that aspect of Symfony or Laravel or whatever you're trying to teach back. And that'll be really fresh in your mind, and that's really, really important because, as we'll see in a bit, empathy is really important. And it's all about communication. So the best teachers communicate well. For me, when you went to university, was your favorite teacher the one that knew everything, like the PhD researcher that's doing research but doesn't really care to be in class? Or was it the teacher that might have known less than that teacher but was really excited to teach you, and you could like communicate really easily, was passionate about the topic? It's for me anyways, it was always those teachers that made me want to stay in class. Otherwise I would just skip. I would just like not go to class. So it's really those teachers that were passionate about what they were doing, what they were teaching, that really got me to stay there. And it wasn't really so much about like, oh, this one teacher knows more than the other one. It was really about how they taught it back to me. And that's really, really important and has nothing to do with what you know. So it's really more important that they understand what you're going through, that they can empathize with the ideas or the struggles that you're going through as a student, because it's very common when you've been working for something for a very long time to think it's really easy. If you're a nuclear physicist and you have to like teach just basic physics, it's really, really simple for you. And you've forgotten what it is to even learn those topics, like the struggles, like what's hard, what's not. And it's really, those aspects are so much more important than what you actually know. And that's why you don't need a PhD. You don't need a PhD in computer science to teach computer science topics. You don't even need a university degree. Some of the best developers I know don't even have a university degree. It's really, really, really about the empathy. It's really about who is my student, who am I teaching to? Am I teaching to PHP developers? Am I teaching to WordPress developers? Like especially in PHP, the skill level is so big between when you start. A lot of people just learn programming from PHP, and then you have people that come with Java backgrounds, computer science backgrounds, and also do PHP. And what is hard for them or easy for them is completely different. So it's really, really important to empathize with who you're trying to teach. But again, this has nothing to do with what you know. So it has nothing to do with the knowledge that you have or don't have. And that's why I would say that you can go even so far and teach something that you don't know anything about at first. And when I was researching this talk, actually, there are a couple of places in the world where this is how it works in class. The teacher, they're trying to learn something new, whether it's like poetry or mathematics or whatnot, and they split the students in groups, and then each student gets a topic to learn, and then they have to teach it back to the group. And it really forces them to use these effective learning strategies that you might not have used otherwise to really, really master the material. In fact, I used to do that in university. I don't know if, did any of you like try to teach back things when you were in university or in school? Like you were learning something and your friend didn't know how to do it, and then you sat down with them and went through a problem. I always felt that I knew those courses where I did that, I knew the stuff 10 times better than every other class. And I think there's a truth to that. There's a truth to being able to explain something, because it really forces you to use these different learning strategies to learn the material better. And as usual, these student groups had to be able to answer questions. So you had to know enough that you could have questions and have discussions. And these discussions between the group arguing, oh, why did you do it this way? Why didn't you do it that way? Why? And being able to explain that really crystallizes that knowledge in your mind. And usually that gave better results than listening to the teacher, because I don't listen, at least for me personally, I have trouble listening to teachers when I was in school. So the idea of teaching it back, I had a lot easier time learning material when I was teaching it back to other students. And the good news is you can do this too. You can just pick a topic that you want to learn about, and you can find a way to teach it. And I've done that for functional programming. You can do it for whatever topic you'd be interested in learning more about or getting better at. You can just pick it and start trying to teach it back to someone. But it's important to realize that it doesn't mean that you won't be wrong, which is a terrible thing to tell developers, because we hate being wrong. We never want to be wrong, but we have to accept that there is limit to knowledge. Nobody, even the best physicist in the world, doesn't know everything, and they can make mistakes, and it's normal. You're never always going to be right. which is also a struggle because, again, with imposter syndrome and things like that, you're always scared. I mentor a lot of speakers, and there's a lot of fear, especially with questions and things like that. Oh, what if I don't know a question or an answer to a question or something like that, or if I give the wrong answer? And those things happen, and there's always going to be limits to your knowledge, or maybe somebody that knows the information better than you, or things like that. But in general, it's okay to not always be right. It's okay to be wrong. In fact, most of us are going to be so scared of being wrong anyways that we're going to research even more. We're going to make even more efforts to not be wrong, and we're going to do even more efforts to know what we're talking about, because we have to teach it back, and we have this fear of being caught not knowing the answer to a question or a comment or something like that. But the good news is, because you do that, you shouldn't do any serious mistakes. And that's why it's the whole point with learning by teaching, because by learning that way, you can just really force yourself. It puts you in these awkward situations where you're like doing more effort because you have this fear in the back of your head that you'll say something bad, or you'll say the wrong thing, or you won't know the answer to a question. So it really forces you to master something to a higher degree than if you just did it by doing, and then you can just tell somebody, well, I did it that way and it works. And you can't arrive. If somebody, sometimes you do say that in a conference talk, but how would you feel if you went to a conference talk and like the speaker every time answered, well, I did it that way, I don't know why, but it worked. And you'd be like, well, that doesn't really help me. It doesn't really help my specific situation. It doesn't really help understand this kind of topic that you might have not talked in depth as much as I would have liked. So those are really, and that's why it's really interesting and good to learn that way. So, but there's still limits. So when I think about the limits of a topic, so if I'm going to learn, let's say I don't know about a topic and I want to teach it. So when would it be when would it be right to tell yourself, I should not teach this? And usually what I think about is the impact of if I was wrong. So if I gave the wrong answer, or if I gave the wrong advice, or things like that. And the biggest example that I can think of, well, there's other ones. There's like stuff like crypto. You wouldn't arrive and say somebody, oh, I'm going to learn how to do a compression algorithm, and it'll be super easy. But in general, one example that I use a lot as a conference organizer is mental health. I wouldn't do a talk on mental health. I've been struggled with significant mental health issues, and I wouldn't arrive and tell people, oh, well, you should do this or that, or that should be left to somebody with very relevant experience, or a therapist or something like that. So like when there's a possible like strong negative health impact or things like that, or just you have to think about like really what the impact of being wrong could be. And I find like, for example, mental health is a really is a good example where the potential for harm to other people outweighs the benefit of just teaching it to a group of individuals. But really, how many topics can you really think that are like mental health or cryptography or compression, or like where, yeah, can you imagine, I was just thinking just right now, can you imagine if you came to a talk and you told your group to encode passwords in plain text or something like that? Like, there's an example where like if you don't know, if you're going to talk about cryptography and how to encrypt passwords, and you just tell them like, just use like a SHA encryption that's like been broken like 2 decades ago as like an encryption method that's valid. Those are not good topics that you should talk about. But in general, there's really not that many of them. So in general, you're pretty safe. Any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned some ways of teaching.
sorry, some ways
I
of
think you mentioned some ways of teaching
by learning.
learning by teaching.
Yeah.
Yeah, but is like writing a blog post will be a good
Oh,
way to learn
yeah.
teach other people?
Yeah, so the question is, I've talked about some ways of learning by teaching. Would writing a book be a good way to do that? I'm going to hold your question for just after, because I'm going to just talk about different ways that you can actually do this in the next section. I will not talk about, I didn't have a section on a book in this, but I can, yeah, I can. A blog post I have, so I'll talk about blog posts. But I can also talk. I have a book as well, so I can talk about writing books as well, and I'll get back to it after the next section. So, where can yeah?
When you try to always have this approach of learning by teaching, is it, in your experience, feasible to always have to learn in depth, especially with how the tech world is changing?
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of things
Oh
that
yeah.
need to be learned.
That's an excellent question. So the question was, with learning by teaching, because there's a larger time investment to doing that, is it worthwhile doing it for everything, considering the tech world is changing a lot? And I think that it's a mix. So you should go based on your personal, like if you want to learn something, you should invest the time and learn it, regardless that it'll be valid in the future or not. But if you want to really invest in learning by teaching and try to learn stuff that'll be valid for longer, I would go with more fundamental topics. So if you want to learn, let's say if you want to go into the JavaScript world or things like that, I'm pretty still very on the fence for the JavaScript frameworks, but I would still learn, for example, how to write modern JavaScript and teach that back. So what I was talking about, like instead of teaching, just put ES6 in front of every JavaScript query that you want to put in Google, I would learn about the new HTTP APIs and things like that, and then you can teach that back. Or it could be things like, I want to learn about functional programming, I'm going to teach that back. I've done talks on like just PHP array functions, because those functions are amazing, and functional programming is super useful in certain contexts, and functional programming is always going to be around. It's not something that's going to go away. In fact, if you switch to JavaScript, it's super useful in JavaScript. So those are examples of topics that if you want to learn and teach back are super useful. Architecture, software architecture, design, things like that are super useful topics to me that basically transcend languages and trends. And sometimes it's just, honestly, personally, like some of the most popular things that I've ever done was just taking something that's super common and boring because it's just not sexy right now. Like there's also the problem of like, as a conference organizer, I can talk a lot about that, is just sexy topics, like the topics du jour versus things that are always around. And honestly, one of the most popular articles that I ever wrote was just on PHP strings. Like just all the stuff there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes with strings that you can do with PHP, just the data type and things like that a lot of developers don't know. And I learned a ton just doing that. So those are examples of kind of topics that you can use instead of just focusing on React or like the JavaScript framework or thing that's popular right now. But I feel in PHP, the good thing is that most things are stable. So if you want to write about like Laravel or Symfony, like there's like lasting power to learning about that and learning it well, because those frameworks, those components have been around for a long time and they're not going away. So there's definitely a lot of that. So to go back to the initial question, with the first question, which is, where can you teach? And I think that's really important. You should really try to find, and it's important because it's personal. You should really think about what is the right medium for you to teach on. And then I'm gonna talk about a couple of them. So the easiest one is writing on your own personal website. It's the easiest. It's the most popular way. A lot of developers have their own personal websites. They don't really post on them very regularly, but almost everybody has them. Just at least they have a contact form, so they can be like, when I'm looking for a job, hey, I have a website. It says like what I do and what I know. So we all know how to set up a blog or a static site. It's really, really simple nowadays. And really all you need to do is you pick a topic, you write about it, and then you publish it. And boom. You know, there's nothing more to it. Or so you think. But most of us don't really want to write a blog post and then just nobody sees it. They want to publish it and other developers see it, and they want to promote it. And that's really the major kind of hurdle with blog posts, because there's so many of them, and it's really hard to get over the noise and promoting them. And also, actually, for a lot of developers, we're not used, and just in general, because it might be your first teaching experience, it can be just scary to just put something online. I've met a lot of developers that were just nervous about putting stuff online because it just shone a light on them. Like maybe I suck, you know, maybe I suck, and now everybody's gonna know that I'm not good, or that I'm not as good as I say I am, or that I'll get a lot of critiques or complaints, or they'll be like, oh, you didn't write very well, or that was dry, or you need to explain yourself more, or things like that. And it can be really, really scary to do that. And promoting it can make it worse, because then you promote it and then you put it, you know, for me, the scary thing was always Reddit. So putting it on Reddit and then you get downvoted to hell. And then you're like, well, what did I do? Like, why, what did I do wrong? Especially like I said, I'm with WordPress a lot, and the WordPress subreddit, if you ever go, it's like basically everything's like 0 or neutral, basically. Like everything just gets downvoted, and I was like, you know, is my stuff bad? Like, is it just this subreddit? Like, it can be really, really nerve-wracking to do that and just get downvoted. So that can like exacerbate the whole problems around that. For other people, it's just getting it out. Like, they don't necessarily know. This was really my big problem. So I write about WordPress, but I write about functional programming with WordPress. Where do you put this on the internet? Like, where are the people that are interested in functional programming and WordPress are? And so that can be really hard. Like finding where the people that you want to teach to, where they hang out and things like that, can be really hard. But in general, there's a lot out there because it's such a hard problem, there's a lot of information out there on how to promote blog posts and things like that. And if you ever have any questions, you can definitely like contact me on Twitter or whichever way you prefer. And I'm happy to discuss it with you because I've just done a lot of it, just figuring it out for myself. The next thing you could do is you could do a presentation like this. The great thing with that is that there's plenty of options, especially in Europe, for in the PHP community. There's plenty of options to give a presentation. So you can go to local meetups. Most major cities have a PHP user group that organize events or multiple events each month. Some events are going to be social. At least I don't really know that much about the PHP community in Europe, but in North America, some of them are just like basically we go to a bar and just talk code. So you can't do a presentation at those. But others are just at a co-working space or something like that, and somebody does a presentation on a topic. And it might be just a 15-minute lightning talk. It could be something longer. It depends on the meetup. But that could be you. That could be your first presentation. So, and usually, I find those are great ways to get started with public speaking because the crowd's smaller, it's more casual. It might be with people that you already know, so it feels like more familiar. You're not like looking at a lot of strange faces that you don't know, like if you go to a conference, especially if you're in another country or something like that. So a meetup is great for that. So they're really great ways to start public speaking. And they prepare you to talk at the big leagues, like PHP conferences, like this one. So it's really, really great. Presentations are really great. And in the PHP WordPress community as well, there's just a lot of opportunities for you to learn and teach that way. And the only negative effect is that it might require you to travel if you want to go to if you want to speak at conferences. So if you don't really like traveling, that can be a negative, or you just apply to the one local PHP conference that you have each year. I definitely know people that do that. Like they just speak at their local city's conference, and that's it, because they just don't like traveling. But it's still an opportunity for you to do presentations, and it's just one of the hurdles of public speaking if you want to do it on a larger scale. But for a lot of us, public speaking is really scary. I know you're a speaker. Is there any other speakers in the room? Okay. If you went back in time to your younger self, let's say in grade 6, and you told them that you were going to be a public speaker, would he have laughed in your face? Yeah, I would have been like, this is the biggest joke in my life. Like, I would never do public speaking. Just the idea of speaking in front of class was the most terrifying thing that I ever had to do. It's really, really, it can be really, really scary, and it's definitely not for everyone. Yeah?
You should attend the karaoke, the slideshare.
Yeah, that slideshare karaoke.
It's really, really nice.
Actually, the slideshare karaoke, for me, was the first time I've seen it ever. Like at this conference.
It's so relaxed, and it's really, really cool.
Actually, yeah. Actually, yeah. I think, actually, no, that's what I was going to say. I think it's actually a really great idea if you're not a speaker, because it's a really, you have a couple of beers too, so it's like, takes the edge off, and then you just have to make it up. So it's like, as long as you're kind of ridiculous or whatnot, it works. But yeah, no, slideshare karaoke actually is a really, really, really good way to do that.
So I'm going home to teach my people
to slideshare karaoke.
Slideshare karaoke.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, I think it's really super valid. Oh yeah, that's great. I think that's really great. Like, I saw it yesterday and I was like, that's hilarious. There's definitely struggles with that too, because it can be nerve-wracking to try to improvise. Like, if you've never spoken and you have to improvise some random slide deck that you have no idea about, it can also be really scary. But I think it was brilliant. But in general, for public speaking, a lot of us can overcome this fear with time. We will never necessarily, again, it varies from speaker to speaker. I'm never 100% comfortable speaking in front of people, but I've just learned to see this fear as something that's just there. And that's a lot of how I talk about imposter syndrome as well, in other talks. It's just like, imposter syndrome isn't something that always goes away. It's just something that you learn is kind of the back of your head. It's like that little devil that talks next to your ear. It never really disappears, but you kind of learn to shoo it away, and then it puffs away in a little smoke. Yeah, it wasn't easy for me, but I'm here, I'm speaking to you. I do about between 5 and 7, 8 conferences a year. but it's just consistent practice to just get used to it. Another option is to give a workshop. And a workshop kind of combines like presentation with practical exercises. Workshops are usually super popular with us developers because we're like, oh yeah, we'll sit down and we'll code and we'll learn something. You can offer them paid too, which is like can be a really beneficial thing if you're looking for side income and things like that. But my experience with workshops is that they require a lot more work. And not only do they require a lot more work, but you also have to deal with very different levels of expectations. I can go to a talk, and if I'm like, don't really get anything practical or just a few things out of a talk, I'm like usually okay with it. But if I'm like going to a workshop and it's like, I like expect, I don't know, for me personally, like I just expect to get out like something tangible, much more tangible at the end. Like I'm like, I expect to be able to use, if I'm seeing if I'm doing a workshop on a specific tool or something like that, like I expect to really be able to use that tool, and usually it never works out that way because the workshop it works a lot more slowly than you would like, or it goes too fast, or like it's not learning the right things. It's really different levels of expectations. So personally for me, I'm not a big fan of doing them, but I know a lot of speakers that like doing them and that are really, really good at it. But that's another option. So to wrap things up, by teaching we learn. So this was a super popular Latin proverb by Seneca, and it was taken more or less for granted as something that's like that's just like a natural truth of the world back in the Roman times. But nowadays, it's much more of a fringe idea. Like this idea that you can learn by teaching isn't something that you hear as much. It's more about like learning by doing, or just going to class, just listening to a podcast. But that doesn't mean that the idea doesn't have any merit to it. We're always under pressure to learn things. Like as developers, we're always under pressure. Like things are always changing. There's always the new shiny thing, the new tech. Things, the tech that you use also changes. Like each PHP version, there's new things, new ways to use it. There's always like, even when your tools don't change, the tools themselves like evolve, and you have to keep up with that. So we're like under this constant pressure to learn new things. And that's why really, whether you do a lot of teaching or not is not super important in the grand scheme of things. What's really important if you start doing it a bit is that you'll realize that you learn differently. And hopefully those new learning techniques can stay with you when you're working, when you're at work, or depending on, and whether it's like writing documentation, it'll make you better at writing documentation, for example, because you'll be thinking a bit more about I'd like to joke that you should write documentation. You should be thinking about your future self. Don't write documentation for the person you are right now, because the person you are right now knows a lot more about it than the person necessarily that's going to come back. You're going to be like, I don't remember what I was thinking when I wrote this. And so it's really important. So even with that, it can be beneficial, regardless that you could be teaching your future self, and it's still valuable. So those skills can be used whether you're writing blog posts or speaking at conferences or whatnot. It doesn't matter. Once you do it a bit, they stick with you, and they allow you to just be a better developer to do that. And what I've talked about today is really just one set of ways that we can achieve that. So we have a few seconds for more questions. I can talk really briefly about the book, because I've done a book too. Writing a book is very time consuming. So I would say if you want to write a book, it's kind of like a blog post, but more intense, and especially depending on how you do it. Like I've done like kind of the self-published thing, so I had like screencasts and like code exercise and things like that.
You also use resource like LeanPub, because LeanPub allows you to
So so this was a big. I wrote my book in PHP Storm and in Markdown, and I wrote a Symfony Flex app that converts it to PDF, EPUB, and everything. So, and the base for the code. I don't know how much of you are in the Laravel ecosystem. Do you guys know Adam Watan? So I know Adam a bit, and he just helped me. He told me a bit what he did with his refactor to collection book, and then I just built my own app based on what he had done to do that. Because I didn't want to use LeanPub. Like basically, I just sold it off my own. I mean, that could be an entire like I could do an entire like marketing products for developers talk, but there's a lot more to it. But it was like it's not on LeanPub. It's like really off my own marketing efforts that I did that. But you can use LeanPub. My experience in the financial side of things is that LeanPub, most authors that I know on LeanPub do not make a lot of money, and I made a lot more money. But even selling my book to, like, I basically wrote a book on object-oriented programming for WordPress developers, which is, what I joke is niche within a niche within a niche. And I definitely made more money off that, doing it that way, than I would have on LeanPub, like for most LeanPub users, because it's just the way it works is just like you don't charge enough. And this is a really big thing. Come and talk to me after, and I'll but for just in the teaching aspect, books are much more time consuming. They require you to learn different things. So I didn't talk too much about alternative teaching methods that are kind of popular now that I'm aware of, like teaching on Twitch. Like live coding on Twitch is a thing that I've wanted to experiment with, but I have not. Or just doing a lot of screencasts. Like I've done screencasts, but I've not done it that many. Are we done? We're done. Okay.
If you want to have another question, then it's fine by me. But
Okay, I'm just answering the current question. With screencasts, there's definitely developer, like Wes Bose is like the classic kind of like super successful person that I've done screencast or Laracast or things like that. There are ways you can do that as well, like you can teach via video. My experience doing video is that think of all the quirks that you might hear in a speaker, like I say a lot and like a lot of different things like that. If you heard that in a video, you'd be like, I can't deal with this. So when I had to do screencasts, like I had to do a script, I had to really learn. It was like a lot of work because I had to write a script, record it, multiple takes and things like that. But if that's what you like, then do it that way. Like it's really like I like writing. So most of how I teach is writing. And if that's what you prefer to do screencast, then that's what you should do, because at the end of the day, it's also for you. You're trying to better yourself and you're trying to learn things. So you should pick a medium that resonates with you, whether it's because that's how you like to learn. So if you like to learn with screencasts, it might be worthwhile to do screencasts because you'll be much more sensitive to what makes a good screencast or what makes for a good things like that. So that's all I have in terms of time. But if you want to come and ask me questions after, I'll be glad to answer them.